Damien Voss thought he was abandoning an ordinary wife, but that night, in front of the entire New York underworld, he had just signed his own death warrant. Evelyn Hart didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't say a word. She simply took off her wedding ring, placed it gently on the table, and walked out of his life with a smile that no mob boss in the room dared look directly at. Because they knew something Damien didn't know. The woman who had just left was the one who held them all in her hands. Like and comment. The city you're watching in, so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't go anywhere, because what's about to happen will be unstoppable. The chandelier above the main hall of the Hargrove estate threw light like a confession. Too bright, too honest, exposing everything it touched. 12 crystal tiers, 400 guests. The kind of event where money didn't just talk, it gave speeches. The kind of room where a man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by who stood beside him when the room went quiet. Damien Voss stood at the center of it all, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, holding a glass of scotch he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He was 34 years old, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation, with dark eyes that moved constantly, cataloging exits and threats the way other men tracked sports scores. The Voss Syndicate had been his father's machine and his grandfather's dream, and Damien had spent the better part of a decade turning it into something neither of those men would have recognized. Leaner, more brutal, more efficient. He controlled 6 boroughs worth of supply routes, 3 municipal judges, a state senator whose name appeared in no campaign literature Damien had ever funded, and enough dock workers to shut down half the eastern seaboard if he felt like making a point. He did not feel threatened easily. Tonight he felt something else. Something colder. He felt bored. Evelyn was somewhere in the room. He knew this the way a man knows the location of a piece of furniture he's long since stopped noticing. By inference, by absence of complaint, by the faint gravitational pull of something that was his. She would be near the East Wing, probably speaking with the wives of men whose names mattered, doing the quiet work she always did at these events. Smiling at the right people, deflecting questions about Damien's business with a practiced vagueness that he'd once found reassuring. She'd been doing it for 3 years. She was very good at it. He didn't think about her much. That was the truth of it, stripped of whatever he might have said if anyone had asked directly. 3 years of marriage and Evelyn Hart had settled into his life like weather. Present, occasionally inconvenient, never remarkable. She was the daughter of the late Garrison Hart, whose Chicago organization had collapsed 6 months before the wedding. The marriage had been a stabilizing gesture, a consolidation, 2 names under one roof, one family tree absorbing another, the kind of arrangement that made sense on a whiteboard and occasionally felt like punishment in practice. She wasn't difficult. That was the most honest thing he could say about her. She wasn't loud, wasn't demanding, didn't ask about his business or his absences or the nights he spent in Lower Manhattan with people whose company made lawyers nervous. She ran the household with a quiet competence that bordered on invisible. She attended the events she was expected to attend and said the things she was expected to say, and never, not once in 3 years, had she done anything that surprised him. He had decided, sometime in the last several months, that this made her insufficient. Celeste Marrow was standing near the bar, wearing a red dress that understood exactly what it was doing. She was 28, sharp-edged in a way that felt current rather than inherited, the kind of woman who turned attention into currency and spent it wisely. Her family name opened certain doors that Damien had been circling for 2 years. Her presence in his life, as a fixture, as a public partner, would communicate something that Evelyn's quiet competence never could. Celeste was a statement. Evelyn was a footnote. Damien had made his decision 3 weeks ago. He told Celeste last Tuesday. He hadn't told Evelyn anything. The moment came at 9:47. He'd planned it for the main hall, during the window between the second course and the dessert presentation, when the room had settled into that particular density of conversation and alcohol that made people pay attention without quite knowing why. He crossed the floor with Celeste on his arm, feeling the familiar ripple of attention that followed him everywhere in rooms like this. And he stopped at the center of the space where the chandelier made everything unavoidable. He didn't search for Evelyn in the crowd. He didn't need to. "I want to introduce someone," he said, and his voice carried the way it always did, not loud but certain. the voice of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around his words. Celeste Marrow. Some of you know her family. Going forward, you'll know her as something more. The room understood. Rooms like this always understood the architecture of what was being said. A dozen conversations died mid-sentence. Someone near the east wall set down a champagne flute with a small, precise click. Then Evelyn was there. He didn't know when she'd moved through the crowd, only that she had, arriving at the edge of his peripheral vision like a figure materializing out of still water. She was wearing a dove-gray dress, simple, expensive in the way that required no announcement, her dark hair pinned back in the style she favored for formal events. She looked at Celeste first, a long, measured look that revealed nothing, and then she looked at Damien. Her face was composed. That was the word for it. Not blank, not hurt, not angry. Composed. Like a piece of architecture that had already calculated the force of the blow and decided it would hold. Damien, she said. Just that. Just his name, spoken with a flatness that somehow carried more weight than anything he'd prepared for. This isn't a conversation, he said. He'd rehearsed something more measured, something that gestured toward civility, but standing here in front of 400 people with Celeste's hand on his arm, what came out was the blunter version. The arrangements will be handled privately. Tonight is about moving forward. The room held its breath. Evelyn looked at him for 3 full seconds. He counted them without meaning to. In those 3 seconds, he was aware, in a way that he couldn't have articulated and wouldn't have admitted, that something was happening in her face that he didn't have language for. Not pain, not humiliation. Something more like recognition, as though he'd confirmed something she'd been waiting to verify. Then she reached up, unclasped the thin diamond necklace at her throat, and set it on the nearest table. She slipped the wedding band from her finger. Rose gold, a detail he'd left to the jeweler, as he'd left most of the wedding details to people paid to care about them. She placed the ring beside the necklace, very carefully, very deliberately. She straightened up, she smiled. It was the most unsettling thing he'd seen in years, and he'd watched men die at close range. Not because there was cruelty in it, because there was absolutely nothing in it that resembled the reaction he'd been braced for. It was the smile of a woman who had just been handed confirmation of something she'd suspected for a long time, and who found the confirmation, if not quite a relief, then at least clarifying. "Then I'll leave you to it," she said. She walked out of the main hall through the east doors, and the crowd parted for her without quite seeming to decide to do so, and Damien watched her go with a sensation in his chest that he refused to identify as anything other than irritation. It wasn't until much later, when he was standing in the same spot nursing the scotch he'd finally decided to drink, that he noticed something he hadn't registered in the moment. 3 of the most powerful men in the room, men whose presence at any gathering was a geopolitical event, men who did not display emotion in public under any circumstances, had watched Evelyn leave with expressions he couldn't quite categorize. Not pity, not indifference, something closer to apprehension. He put it aside. He had a new era to inaugurate. The first sign that something was wrong came 4 days later, and it came in the form of a phone call that didn't connect. Marco Cellini ran the Voss Syndicate's northern corridor, the supply chain threading through the Bronx and up into Westchester, 14 distribution points, 6 mid-level captains, and enough cash flow to qualify as a small nation's import economy. He was 51 years old, had worked under Damien's father before Damien himself was old enough to drive, and he answered calls from the Voss number within 2 rings, regardless of the hour. The call rang 7 times, went to voicemail. Damien hung up and called again. Same result. He told himself Marco's phone was dead. By the end of that day, he'd been unable to reach 3 of his captains. By the end of the week, the number was 9. Not dead phones. Not deaths. No bodies. No hospital reports. Just men who had, apparently and without announcement, become unavailable to Damien Voss for the first time in the collective memory of the organization. Then the shipment out of Newark disappeared. Not intercepted, not seized, simply gone. 42 crates of product processed through a dockside warehouse that Damien had been using for 6 years, operated by people he'd trusted long enough that their trustworthiness had become something he'd stopped thinking about. The warehouse crew reported nothing. The overnight staff saw nothing. 4 cameras covering 4 angles of the loading dock had recorded 4 hours of footage that showed absolutely nothing moving through the space that shouldn't have been there, and then showed the crates gone. Damien sat with his head of security, a man named Brennan, who had the dimensions and general affect of a cinder block given a personality, and went through the footage 3 times. Brennan said what he always said when he didn't have answers. "I'll look into it." Damien stopped finding this reassuring sometime around the 2nd hour. His lawyer, a man named Pressman, who wore suits the color of spreadsheets and charged accordingly, called on Thursday to report that 2 of Damien's money laundering operations, both running through shell companies in Delaware, had experienced what he described as structural failures. The word he used was chosen carefully, Damien understood, to avoid the more accurate description, which was that both operations had simply stopped working. The accounts were intact. The companies existed on paper, but the mechanisms that made them function, the relationships, the signing authorities, the informal agreements with the people inside certain financial institutions who knew which questions not to ask, had all, over the course of roughly 72 hours, quietly ceased to operate. "Who?" Damien said. Pressman paused. "No one I can identify," which is itself unusual. The state senator, the one whose name appeared in no campaign literature, sent word through an intermediary that he would be reassessing certain associations in light of evolving circumstances. It was the language of political self-preservation, which Damien recognized, but what he couldn't account for was the timing. There was no scandal, no investigation, no circumstance that should have prompted reassessment. Just a man who had been very reliable for 4 years suddenly becoming very nervous about a relationship that had served him well. Damien began pulling on threads. The pulling led him to Vincent Cale, a mid-level intelligence broker who moved information between criminal organizations the way other men moved freight, carefully, expensively, with careful attention to weight limits. Cale operated out of a restaurant in the West Village that served food as a secondary concern. Damien arrived unannounced on a Wednesday evening, let himself through the kitchen, and sat down across from Cale at the small table in the back office where Cale did his actual business. Cale looked at Damien's arrival with the expression of a man trying to calculate how many exits were available. "Tell me about the Veil," Damien said. The name had surfaced twice in the last 72 hours. Once in a conversation, one of his remaining captains had overheard at a meeting he hadn't been invited to. Once in a file Brennan had pulled from a competitor's seized communications that described a coordinating authority operating above the level of any individual syndicate. Damien knew the name vaguely, the way he knew the names of things that were supposed to be mythological. Something spoken of in certain rooms as a framework for explaining events that didn't otherwise make sense. A hidden hand, an organizing principle, the kind of explanation men reached for when the actual explanation was too complicated or too threatening to examine directly. Cale was quiet for long enough that his quiet became its own answer. "I'm not going to ask you twice," Damien said. "The Veil isn't something people discuss," Cale said finally. "There are subjects in this business that you don't... They're not taboo because of tradition. They're taboo because the people who enforce the taboo are very good at their jobs. I'm not asking about the taboo. I'm asking what it is." "It's real," Cale said. "That's what I can tell you. It's not a rumor. It's not something people invented to explain patterns that seem coincidental. It's a coordinating structure, older than most of the organizations you deal with. It doesn't compete with syndicates. It doesn't take territory. It operates above that level. It connects things, facilitates things, makes sure certain arrangements stay arranged." "Who runs it?" The expression that crossed Cale's face then was one Damien filed carefully. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the face of a man choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, with the understanding that the wrong choice had serious consequences. "I've heard a name," Cale said, "in the last week, connected to what's been happening with your organization." He stopped. "Say it." "Hart," Cale said. "I've heard the name Hart." The room was very quiet. Damien thought about Evelyn's face in the moment she'd set her wedding ring on that table. The smile that had contained absolutely nothing he recognized. He drove back to the townhouse he'd shared with Evelyn for 3 years and stood in the doorway of the room that had been her study. It was the only room in the house that felt different from the others. Not decorated differently, not obviously distinct, but somehow more present. As though more decisions had been made within its walls than anywhere else. He'd never spent much time in it. It was her room. He stood there now and looked at it differently. The desk was clean, too clean, he understood now. The careful blankness of a surface that had been regularly cleared rather than simply unused. He opened the drawers. Standard contents. Stationery, a few personal items, a notebook with grocery lists, and appointment reminders in Evelyn's precise handwriting. He flipped through the notebook. It looked exactly like what it appeared to be. He stood there holding it for a long time. Then he pulled out his phone and called an investigator he used for background work. A woman named Patel who had government contacts and a gift for finding the edges of things that were supposed to have no edges. "I need everything on Evelyn Hart," he said, "before she was Evelyn Voss, before the wedding, before Chicago. I need the full picture." Patel asked how quickly. "Yesterday, he said. She called back in 18 hours. He took the call in his car, parked on a side street in Midtown, rain beginning to drag itself down the windshield in the irregular rhythm of a city that couldn't decide what kind of weather it wanted to be. "I'm going to give you what I have," Patel said, "and I want you to understand that some of what I'm telling you comes from sources that don't normally surface. This isn't standard background. This took me to places I don't usually go." Go. Evelyn Garrison Hart, born 31 years ago. Father was Garrison Hart, Chicago. You know that part. Mother died when she was 6. She was educated in Europe, Switzerland, then London, which is in her records, but the details of those years are thin in ways that don't feel accidental. She returned to the U.S. when she was 22. A pause. The years between 22 and the start of her recorded presence in Chicago, there's a gap of about 14 months that I can't account for. Define can't account for. I mean, the records exist, but they're layered in a way that suggests professional construction. Not fraud exactly, something more sophisticated. Someone with considerable resources built a version of those 14 months that looks real from the outside. It doesn't feel real when you get close to it. Damien stared at the rain. "Her father's organization," he continued. "I need to understand how it actually collapsed." Another pause. Longer. "The official story is financial overextension and federal pressure. That's what was reported. That's what your people were told." "And the actual story?" "From what I can find, the Chicago organization didn't collapse. It was strategically withdrawn. There's a difference. Assets were liquidated deliberately over a period of 8 months. Personnel were redistributed rather than laid off. It looks like collapse from the outside. From the inside, if you could see inside, it looks more like a controlled restructuring." "Restructuring into what?" "I don't know," Patel said, and she said it in the way she said things she was sure of. "Whatever it became something I can't see." He sat with that. The rain intensified briefly, then pulled back to its previous indecision. "One more thing," Patel said. "I want you to hear this clearly. In the course of trying to pull on Evelyn Hart's history, I reached out to 3 sources I've been using for over a decade. 2 of them stopped responding to me after I asked about her. The third told me directly that there were subjects he wouldn't discuss and that I shouldn't ask again." Damien said nothing. "I've been doing this for 15 years, Patel said. "People don't scare my sources. Not usually. Not this quickly." After he hung up, he sat in the car for a long time. Outside, the city moved around him in its indifferent way, taxis and pedestrians, and the slow geological drift of people going from where they were to where they needed to be. He watched it without seeing it. He thought about 3 years. About a woman who cooked breakfast on Sunday mornings with the radio on low, who read in bed until he came in and turned out the light, who attended 400 events like last Saturday's without once revealing a single thing that was actually true about herself. He thought about the captains going dark, the money routes folding, the senator backing away. He thought about the faces of powerful men watching Evelyn walk out of the Hargrove estate. He thought about a network called The Veil. He thought about the name Hart. He reached for his phone to call Brennan and stopped, because the thought that arrived, fully formed and devastating, was this. If Evelyn was what Patel's investigation suggested she might be, if the gaps and the constructed records and the frightened sources pointed toward something real rather than toward coincidence, then the people around Damien, the people he'd trusted with his security and his operations and his life, they would have been in contact with her organization for years. Some of them might have known, some of them might have been watching. He was potentially the least informed person in his own organization about the person who'd been sleeping beside him for 3 years. The rain made up its mind and started coming down hard. Damien started the car. He needed to find Evelyn Hart before whatever was dismantling his empire finished the job. He needed to look her in the face and understand what he was actually dealing with. And he needed to do it through channels that didn't pass through anyone whose loyalty he could no longer be certain of. What he didn't know, sitting in that car in the rain with the city moving around him and 3 years of assumptions crumbling under the weight of 18 hours of investigation, was that Evelyn already knew he was looking. She'd known since the morning after the gala. She'd been deciding ever since what she wanted to do about it. And the decision she was arriving at was one that would change everything. Not just for Damien, not just for the Voss syndicate, but for every criminal organization on the eastern seaboard that had spent years believing it operated independently of anything above it. The call came at 2 a.m. It was Brennan. "We've got a problem," he said. "Define it." "The Newark warehouse crew. All 6 of them. They've been found." Damien waited. "They're alive," Brennan said. "That's not the problem. The problem is what they're saying. They're saying someone came in during the window. One person, no team, no backup, no weapons visible. Walked through the loading dock, spoke to them for approximately 4 minutes, and walked out. And every one of them agreed, without any apparent coercion, to report they'd seen nothing." The silence stretched. "One person," Damien said. "One person." "Did they describe?" "They described a woman," Brennan said. "Dark hair, gray dress, very calm." Damien hung up. He sat very still for a moment in the dark of his living room, in the house that still smelled faintly of Evelyn's presence. Something light, something that had nothing to do with perfume and everything to do with the 1,000 small habits of a person who had lived within these walls. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that he had made an error of stunning proportions. Not the error of replacing her, the error of never having seen her at all. He didn't sleep. That was the first thing. He lay on top of the covers in the dark with his shoes still on and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. And after 2 hours of this, he got up and went to the kitchen and made coffee. He didn't drink and stood at the window watching the street below with the specific alertness of a man who has recently discovered that the ground beneath him is not what he believed it to be. The city looked the same. That was the absurd part. 4:15 in the morning, and the street below the townhouse was doing what streets in this part of Manhattan always did at 4:15. A garbage truck grinding through its rounds 3 blocks east, a taxi idling at the corner waiting for a fare that wasn't coming, a woman in a coat walking a small dog with the hunched purposefulness of someone who wanted to be back inside. The city had no idea. The city didn't care. Damien Voss could be unraveling in real time, and the street below would keep moving with the same indifferent rhythm it had maintained for 100 years before him and would maintain for 100 years after. He called Brennan at 5. "Get everyone in," he said. "The core. Not the captains, not the outer ring. Core only. My office. 8 o'clock. "Which core?" Brennan said. There was something careful in the way he asked it, a fraction of a pause before the words that Damien registered and filed. "You know which core," Damien said, and hung up. He showered. He changed. He ate something, crackers and cold coffee, standing over the kitchen sink, because he'd learned a long time ago that the body's needs didn't pause for crisis, and a man who forgot to eat made worse decisions than a man who didn't. His father had taught him that. His father had taught him a number of things that had seemed like wisdom at the time, and now felt like a partial map of a country that turned out to be much larger than the map suggested. At 7:40, he drove himself to the office building in Midtown that housed, on its upper floors, the legitimate face of the Voss operation, a private equity firm whose name appeared on charitable donations and industry panels and whose actual function was the administrative spine of everything else. He took the elevator to the 14th floor. He walked past the receptionist who had worked there for 6 years and who greeted him the way she always did, and he thought for the first time about what she might know and what she might have been told. He thought this about everyone now. That was what the night had done to him. Brennan was already there. So were the other 3 men Damien had met when he said core. Walsh, who ran the financial structures, Connolly, who managed the political relationships, and a man everyone called Trick, whose actual name was Patrick Caruso, and whose function was the kind of operational problem-solving that didn't appear in any organizational chart. 4 men in a room with Damien, the people who were supposed to know everything. He stood at the head of the table and looked at them and said, "Tell me what you know about the Veil." The silence had texture. He could feel it. Not the silence of people who don't know something, but the silence of people deciding how much to say about something they do. Walsh spoke first, which surprised Damien because Walsh was the least likely of the 4 to move before he'd calculated the cost. "That's a significant question," Walsh said. "I know it is. Answer it." "It's not." Walsh stopped. Tried again. "There are structures in this business that exist outside the normal framework. The Veil is the oldest. It doesn't compete. It doesn't take sides. I know what it does," Damien said. "I'm asking what you know about it." Another silence. Brennan was looking at the table. Connolly had his hands flat on the surface in front of him, fingers spread, the posture of a man bracing for something. Trick, characteristically, was watching Damien with an expression that gave away nothing and processed everything. "How long," Damien said, "has my organization had contact with the Veil?" "Damien," Brennan started. "How long?" Brennan looked up. His face was the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just been asked to set it down in a way that was going to cost him. "Your father made an arrangement," he said, "years before you took over. The terms were, it was a stability agreement. They don't interfere, we operate normally. Certain things are off limits. Certain information flows in certain directions." "What information?" "Operational updates. Nothing that compromised." Brennan stopped at whatever he saw in Damien's face. "Monthly updates. Who was moving where? New partnerships. Significant personnel changes." "Personnel changes," Damien said. "Like marriages." The room was very quiet. "Like marriages," Brennan said. Damien pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down in it very deliberately, the way he'd been taught to sit down in rooms where the act of sitting was itself a statement. He put his hands on the table and looked at Brennan, and then at Walsh, and then at Connolly, and then at Trick, and he let the silence do the work for a moment because the silence was saying things he didn't have clean language for yet. "So you knew," he said, "when she came into this house, you knew what she was." "We knew there was a connection," Brennan said. "We didn't know the extent. I want to be clear about that. We knew she was associated with the Veil's network through her father's organization. We didn't know she was—" He stopped again. "Say it." "We didn't know her position." "But you suspected." A pause that was, itself, a confirmation. "Things happened when she was present that didn't happen when she wasn't," Brennan said. "Situations resolved cleanly. Certain threats went away. We didn't ask questions about it because the results were— because it was convenient," Damien said. "It was convenient, so you didn't ask." "That's not— That's exactly what it is." His voice was level. This was the most frightening version of Damien Voss. The people who worked for him knew. Not the raised voice, not the obvious anger, but this. The very still, very precise version that arrived when the anger had gone somewhere internal and was doing work he couldn't see yet. "You watched me replace her. You were in that room. You stood there and watched me do it, and not one of you said a word. You didn't ask." "I'm not asking now," Damien said. "I'm telling you what I know about what happened in that room. I'm telling you that you watched me walk out onto a ledge, and you said nothing, because telling me meant admitting you'd been feeding information to my wife's organization for years without my knowledge." "Is that approximately correct?" Connolly said quietly. "Yes." Damien looked at him. Connolly was 62 years old. a former political operative who had moved sideways into criminal support work with the smoothness of a man who'd always understood that the lines between those two things were matters of public relations rather than substance. He was the most honest of the four when honesty was unavoidable. "Thank you," Damien said. Then he looked at all of them again. "I need to find her. I need to sit across from her and understand what I'm dealing with. And I need to do it in the next 48 hours before whatever she's doing to this organization goes far enough that there's nothing left to save." He paused. "Can any of you help me with that, or have I been operating a charity for the last 3 years?" It was Trick who spoke. He had a habit of waiting until everyone else had spent themselves before he said anything, which meant that when he spoke, the room tended to listen. "I have a contact," he said. "Someone inside the courier network that serves the Vale's outer ring. Not someone who can take me to her, but someone who might be able to get a message to the right place." "Do it," Damien said. "Today." He dismissed them and sat alone in the room for a while after they left. He was thinking about Evelyn on Sunday mornings. The radio low, the smell of coffee from the kitchen reaching the bedroom before anything else. He'd been half awake those mornings, listening without meaning to, and she'd moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that he'd taken for domesticity. He understood now that the efficiency was real and the domesticity was the performance. He understood that the woman who'd handed him coffee and asked about his evening plans had been, at the same moment, the administrative center of an organization so large and so old that the men he thought were powerful had treated her like a sovereign. He felt, and this surprised him, something close to respect. Underneath the anger and the humiliation and the cold tactical fear, there was something that recognized what she'd done and found it, against his will, extraordinary. He pushed it down. It wasn't useful yet. The message Trick sent came back with a response in 6 hours. Not an address. Not a meeting time. A single line delivered through the courier contact and relayed to Trick's phone, and from there to Damien's, the provenance of it stripped away so that all that remained were the words themselves. Thursday, the Aldine, 9 o'clock. Come alone. The Aldine was a private dining club in the West 50s, the kind of place that didn't appear on any review site and didn't take reservations through channels that normal people could access. Damien had been there twice, both times as a guest of men who moved at the level where the Aldine made sense. He knew what it signified. Not a meeting on neutral ground exactly, but something close. A meeting on ground where the rules of certain kinds of violence didn't apply, where the conversation was the thing. Thursday was 2 days away. He spent those 2 days doing damage assessment and trying not to look like he was doing damage assessment. The picture that emerged was not good. 12 distribution points had gone dark. Not through seizure or violence, but through the simple failure of the human systems that operated them. People who didn't show up. Agreements that dissolved. The invisible connective tissue of an organization quietly being withdrawn. 3 of his shell companies were functionally inert. Their mechanisms intact but non-operational in the way a clock is non-operational when someone has removed a single gear that doesn't look essential until it's gone. The political network, the judges, the senator, the 2 city council members whose relationships with Damien's interests had been mutually beneficial for years, was contracting with a speed that suggested coordinated signaling rather than individual calculation. Something was telling them to step back. Something they listened to. On Wednesday evening, Celeste called him for the 3rd time that week. He let it ring. She wasn't relevant to what was happening, which was a brutal reduction of a person to their functional value, but he was past the point of managing that particular discomfort. She existed in a version of his future that had been rendered hypothetical by the events of the last 10 days. He'd deal with that when he had bandwidth for it, which was not now. He met Walsh privately on Wednesday night in a parking structure in the 40s where the acoustics killed any recording and the sightlines made surveillance impractical. Walsh was the one he'd always trusted most with the financial picture, and Walsh's discomfort with the conversation was significant precisely because Walsh was not a man who displayed discomfort easily. "Tell me the number," Damien said. "The actual number. What's recoverable if this continues at the current rate for another 2 weeks?" Walsh was quiet for a moment. Parking structure quiet, which had a specific quality. The distant sound of tires on concrete, the mechanical sigh of an elevator somewhere. The city happening at a remove. If the pattern holds, Walsh said, and if the remaining political relationships follow the ones we've already lost, you're looking at roughly 30% of operational capacity, maybe less. In 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, Damien leaned against the concrete pillar and thought about 30%. 30% meant survival in a technical sense. You could run a criminal organization at 30% the way you could live on 30% of a normal food intake, technically viable and practically devastating. It meant vulnerability. It meant the families who'd been watching from a distance would start doing arithmetic about what a weakened Voss syndicate was worth to them as a target, rather than as a neighbor. Is anyone buying? He said. Any of our people? Has anyone been approached about switching alignment? Walsh paused. Connolly got a call, he said. Tuesday. He told me about it, which is why I'm telling you rather than not telling you. The caller represented the Marchetti family. They wanted to know about his ongoing value and his ongoing loyalty and whether those two things were likely to remain aligned. The Marchetti family. Damien had 3 standing disputes with the Marchetti family, all of them simmering at the level of professional friction rather than open conflict. All of them the kind of thing that stayed manageable as long as everyone involved understood the relative weight on each side of the equation. If the Marchettis were making calls about Damien's inner circle, then the equation had shifted in a way that was legible to people who should not yet have had reason to read it. Who else? Damien said. I don't know. Connolly told me about himself. I'm not in a position to account for the others. He drove home through traffic that moved with the specific futility of Midtown at 6 p.m. and thought about the people around him. Not in the abstract, specifically. Each face, each history, each year of association, and each moment retroactively visible when information might have moved in directions he hadn't been tracking. He'd built an organization on the principle that loyalty was a function of mutual interest. You kept your people loyal by making their interests and yours the same thing, so that betraying you was equivalent to betraying themselves. It was a principle that worked until something came along that could recalibrate those interests faster than you could respond. Something like the veil, something like Evelyn. Thursday arrived the way days arrive when you've been waiting for them. Too slowly, and then suddenly. He ate dinner alone in the townhouse, changed into a suit he'd bought after the gala and hadn't worn yet, and got into a car without a driver because the instruction had said alone, and he intended to honor it, not because he trusted the instruction, but because violating it before he'd even seen her face seemed like a bad opening move. The Aldean's entrance was a dark green door on a side street that looked from the outside like a service entrance for the building it occupied. He went in at 9 o'clock exactly. A woman he'd never seen before took his coat without being asked and directed him through a corridor to a room in the back. Not the main dining room, but a smaller space, private, 4 walls and 2 chairs, and a table with a bottle of wine that was already open, and 2 glasses and nothing else. Evelyn was already there. She was sitting in the chair that faced the door, which told him something, and she was wearing dark clothes, which was different from every event he'd ever attended with her. She looked like herself and not herself simultaneously. The same face, the same posture, the same quality of absolute composure. But something in the room around her had a different weight than rooms had ever had when he'd been aware of her in them before. The composed surface was the same. What it was composing was evidently something much larger than he'd understood. She didn't stand. She looked at him and waited while he crossed the room and sat in the other chair, and then she looked at him some more, and the silence had the quality of a surface that was letting him settle before it decided what to do. You wanted to find me, she said. Not a question. You know I did. I made it possible for you to find me, she said. That's different from you finding me. He absorbed this. Okay, he said. Ask what you came to ask. He'd prepared questions. Standing in the kitchen that morning, he'd organized them with the same methodical attention he brought to any operational planning. What to lead with, what to hold back, what to use as a pivot point when he needed to shift the pressure. Sitting across from her now, the preparation felt like a structure built for a different room. He set it aside and asked the thing that was actually true. How long? He said. How long what? All of it. How long was there a version of this that I didn't know about? Evelyn considered. She picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking. "My father built the foundation," she said. "I took it over when I was 23. The organization you know as the Veil has existed in various forms for a long time. My version of it is 11 years old." 11 years. He'd been running the Voss syndicate for 9. "And our marriage," he said, "was my choice," she said, "not an operational decision. I want to be clear about that because I imagine you've constructed a version of this in which I was installed beside you for strategic reasons. That's not what happened." "Then what happened?" Something moved in her face. Not the composure cracking exactly, more like the light shifting across it, revealing texture that had always been there. "I met you at a dinner in 2019, she said. "You were talking to 3 men who were clearly afraid of you, and you were treating that fear like it bored you. I found that interesting. Then I found other things interesting. Then I made a decision that I'm not in the habit of making, which was to be something other than what I am for a while and see what it felt like." "And what did it feel like?" "For a long time it felt like something I wanted to keep," she said. He was quiet. "And then," she said, "it felt like something I was maintaining rather than something I was living. And then you replaced me at a party in front of people who knew exactly what they were watching, and that particular experiment concluded." He wanted to say something that was honest rather than tactical. He wasn't accustomed to the distinction mattering. "I was wrong," he said. "Yes. That's not an apology." "I'll get to that. Right now I need to understand what's happening to my organization and what you intend to do about it." Evelyn set the wine glass down. "What's happening to your organization," she said, "is a natural consequence of my withdrawal, not a punishment. I want you to understand that distinction. The structures that functioned well while I was present functioned well because of the stability my network provided from underneath. I didn't install mechanisms to hurt you. I simply stopped providing support, and you're seeing what your operation looks like without it." The honesty of this was almost worse than malice would have been. "And the Marchettis?" he said. Her expression shifted slightly. "The Marchettis are a separate problem," she said. "They're not acting on my behalf. They're acting on the perception of opportunity." She paused. "Which is not a problem I created, but it is a problem you're going to have to address." "With what resources?" "That depends," she said, "on what we decide tonight." He looked at her across the small table, in the quiet of the private room, and he thought about 3 years of Sunday mornings, and a woman who had apparently been running the largest shadow organization in the American underworld between coffee and the crossword. He thought about Brennan's face when he'd said personnel changes, like marriages. He thought about the warehouse crew who'd agreed without coercion to say they'd seen nothing because a woman in a gray dress had talked to them for 4 minutes and left. "What are you offering?" he said. "I'm not offering anything yet," she said. "I'm telling you that a conversation is happening. What it produces depends on whether you're capable of something you haven't demonstrated a particular talent for in the time I've known you." "Which is honesty," she said, "with yourself primarily, about what you are and what you're not, about why you did what you did at that gala. Not the strategic rationale. I know the strategic rationale, the actual reason." He held her gaze. The room was very still. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of the Aldine, the city was doing its relentless thing, motion and noise, and the perpetual grinding of people against each other. And here there was just the two of them, and a question he hadn't expected to have to answer out loud. He opened his mouth to speak, and that was when Trick's name appeared on his phone screen, and the message beneath it contained 4 words that made the conversation with Evelyn, pressing and essential as it was, suddenly secondary to something more immediately dangerous. They hit the Brennan house. He looked up at Evelyn and found her already watching him with an expression that told him she'd been waiting for something like this, that whatever was arriving was not a surprise to her, and that the conversation they'd been having had just become considerably more complicated than either of them had framed it. "Whatever you're about to tell me," she said quietly, "say it fast, because we may be out of time." He showed her the message. She read it once, set the phone down on the table between them, and stood up in a single motion that contained no hesitation at all. That was the first thing he registered. Not alarm, not surprise, but the fluid efficiency of someone shifting from one operational mode to another, the way an engine shifts gears. She was already moving toward the door when he caught her arm. "Brennan's family," he said. "His wife. His kids. I know who lives in that house." She didn't pull away from his grip, but she looked at his hand until he released it. "The question is who sent the message and from where, because if Trick is still at a location he was at when he sent it, he's compromised." Damien was already calling. Trick picked up on the second ring, which meant he was mobile. Trick never answered quickly when he was stationary, a habit from years of needing to assess his environment before committing to a conversation. "Where are you?" Damien said. "Moving," Trick said. "West. I'm west of the incident." "The family?" "Wife and the 2 kids got out. Brennan got them out before it escalated. The house it's significant damage. Someone sent a message." "Brennan, with me, he's—" A pause that had something specific in it, some texture of withheld information. "He's not good. He's functional, but he's not good." "Bring him to the—" Evelyn put her hand on his forearm. Light pressure, directive. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed at herself, then made a small circular gesture he interpreted correctly as "let me handle the location." He watched her cross to the far side of the room, pull out a phone he'd never seen her use, and make a call in under 30 seconds that consisted of 4 sentences, none of which he could fully hear. She came back. "Pier 44 in Red Hook," she said. "Freight warehouse, east side. My people will have it secured by the time you arrive." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "I'll take a separate route. Arrive before you." "Your people," he said. "Yes." "At a location you're now providing." She stopped, looked at him with an expression that held beneath its surface something that might have been impatience and might have been something more complicated. "You can choose not to trust me," she said. "That's available to you. But someone just put fire to Brennan's house while his children were inside, and whoever did it knew enough about your organization to find his private address, which means you have a leak that goes deeper than the captain's going dark. So you can stand here and audit my intentions, or you can get in your car." He got in his car. Red Hook at 10:30 at night had the quality of a place that had opted out of the city's relentless self-promotion, warehouses and waterfront, and the low industrial smell of the harbor, the Manhattan skyline visible across the water like an argument being made by someone else. Pier 44 was a working freight facility during daylight hours. At this hour it was dark except for the lights inside the East Warehouse, which were on when Damien arrived, and which meant Evelyn had been telling the truth about timing. There were 4 people he didn't recognize positioned at the warehouse entrance. They looked at him the way professionals look at arrivals. Assessment, not hostility. The specific evaluation of people who've been told to expect someone and are confirming the description matches. One of them opened the door. Inside, Trick, standing near a metal table with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, the posture of a man who'd been moving fast and hadn't had a chance to settle. Brennan, sitting on a folding chair with his forearms on his knees and his head down in a way that communicated, even from across the warehouse floor, the specific devastation of a man who'd just watched his home burn. And Evelyn, already there as promised, standing a few feet from Brennan with her arms crossed and her face in the careful neutral she wore when she was doing the work of reading a situation before she spoke into it. Damien crossed to Brennan. The man looked up. His face was wrong in a specific way. Not injured, no physical damage, but the structural wrongness of someone whose internal architecture had just been significantly rearranged. Brennan was not a man who frightened easily. Damien had watched him sit across tables from people who made other people's hands shake, and Brennan's hands had never shaken. His hands were not entirely steady now. "The family's safe," Damien said. "Karen's at her sister's place." Brennan's voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when the emotion behind them is too large to inflect normally. "I called ahead. She got the kids out before the second—" He stopped, reorganized. "Before it got worse." "Who knew your address and—" Brennan looked at him. Something moved in his expression, some recognition of what the question was actually asking. "A lot of people know my address," he said. "People in this organization." "Yes." "All 4 of the Corps." Brennan was quiet. "Brennan." "All 4, he said. "And the captains, and the outer ring through the standard security protocols." He paused. "It's not a small number." "It doesn't need to be a large number." Evelyn said from across the space. Both men looked at her. She walked toward them, unhurried, covering the warehouse floor with the same quality of motion she covered every floor. Like the space was already hers, and she was simply moving through what she owned. It needs to be one number, one person who made a call tonight. She stopped a few feet from Brennan and looked at him directly. You know something you haven't said yet. I can see it. Brennan's jaw tightened. He looked at Damien. There was, in that look, a conversation that had been happening for years. The specific communication between a man who runs security and the man he runs it for. All the things said and unsaid in the architecture of their working relationship. And there was, in this particular version of that look, something that Damien hadn't seen before. An apology. Not the kind that follows an error, the kind that follows a choice. Connolly, Brennan said. The name landed in the space between the three of them and sat there. Connolly called you tonight, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. An hour before the fire. He said he needed to know where I was. I told him I was home. He said... Brennan stopped. His hands pressed against his knees, a small motion, contained. He said he needed to know for operational reasons, that Damien had asked him to account for everyone's location. Damien felt the specific cold of it move through him. He'd made no such request. That's not all, Evelyn said. Brennan looked at her with an expression that had something of animal recognition in it, the look of a person confronting someone who can see through the usual surfaces. No, he said, that's not all. He asked if I'd told Damien about the Marchetti call, the one Walsh told Damien about. And you said? I said Walsh had mentioned it. I said Damien knew. And the call ended. And 40 minutes later, my house was on fire. The warehouse was quiet except for the water sounds from the harbor. Irregular, indifferent, and the hum of a generator somewhere in the building's infrastructure. Damien stood very still. He was doing the arithmetic in his head, laying the timeline over what he knew about Connolly, about the Marchetti contact, about the week of unraveling that had started the night after the gala. The arithmetic was not complex. The arithmetic was, in fact, devastatingly simple once you knew which numbers went where. Connolly isn't working for the Marchettis, Evelyn said. She was looking at Damien now. The Marchettis are working for Connolly, or more precisely, Connolly is working for the people the Marchettis work for. Damien turned to look at her fully. Explain that. Sit down, she said. I'll stand. She accepted this without comment. There are 3 families on the eastern seaboard whose cooperation would be required for a coordinated move against the Voss syndicate at the level you've been experiencing. The Marchettis are one of them. The other 2 are the Salter organization out of Baltimore and the Renfield network in Boston. I've been tracking movement in all 3 organizations for the last 10 days. She paused. They're moving in coordination. That requires a coordinating signal, someone who has access to all 3 and sufficient leverage to align them toward a single target. And that's Connolly. Connolly is the relay, she said. He's not the architecture. Someone is using Connolly because Connolly is inside your organization and has been feeding information out for... She looked at Brennan. How long has he worked for you? 7 years, Brennan said. Then for some portion of 7 years, she said, someone has had a channel into the Voss operation through Connolly. They used it to watch. They used the stability my network provided to keep things quiet while they positioned. And when I left, she stopped. The first stop he'd heard from her tonight that felt like something other than a strategic pause. When I left, they moved, because my protection was the only thing that was keeping them from moving. Damien felt the full weight of it settle. They waited for you to leave. They may have arranged for you to give me reason to leave, she said. The silence that followed was the most specific silence of the night. He looked at her and she looked back at him with an expression that held, very precisely, the fact that she was giving him this information without commentary, without the pointed elaboration that would have made it into an accusation rather than a statement. But the statement was clear enough on its own. Someone had known about Celeste. Someone had known about Damien's growing restlessness, his calculation about what Evelyn represented versus what a different kind of partner might represent. Someone had fed that calculation, or shaped it, or simply waited for it to reach its natural conclusion. And then they had waited for the gala. And then they had watched Evelyn walk out of his life and started making calls. "Celeste," he said. Evelyn said nothing. "Did you know her before? Was she—" "I don't know," Evelyn said. "That's honest. I don't know whether she was placed or whether she was simply available and someone decided to make use of her availability. I'd need to look into it. What I know is that the timing of your interest in her aligns with a period when certain intelligence about your relationship was circulating in channels it shouldn't have been in." He thought about Celeste, the red dress, the way she'd arrived in his orbit at a charity auction 14 months ago and made herself available at exactly the rate that made her seem like his idea. He thought about the conversations he'd had with her that had, in retrospect, consistently circled the subject of Evelyn, Celeste's gentle, apparently casual assessments of Evelyn's quietness, her invisibility, the implicit comparison between a woman who barely registered and a woman who burned. He thought that was attraction. He understood now it might have been cultivation. "I need Connolly," Damien said. He turned to Trick. "Where is he?" Trick had been standing at the edge of this conversation in the way he always stood, still, absorptive, a man who treated other people's information like equipment he was quietly cataloging. "I can have a location in 20 minutes, he said. "Do it now." Trick stepped away with his phone. Damien looked at Brennan. "I need you functional," he said. "I know what tonight was. I know what it cost. I need you to put it somewhere you can get to later and be functional now." Brennan looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, and grief maybe, or the effort of compressing grief into a shape small enough to work around. Then he straightened in the chair. "I'm functional," he said. "Good." Trick came back in 12 minutes, not 20. "He's at the Renfield Hotel," he said. "Midtown East. Checked in 3 hours ago." Renfield. Damien looked at Evelyn. The name of the hotel was the name of one of the 3 families she'd just identified. The coordination of it, the brazenness of it, a man named Connolly checking into a hotel named for one of the organizations he was serving, struck him as either reckless arrogance or the specific confidence of someone who believed the operation was already won. "He thinks you're contained," Evelyn said, reading the same thing. "He doesn't know you're here. He doesn't know I'm here. As far as his information goes, you're at the townhouse processing the Brennan situation, and I'm—" She paused. "I'm wherever I am, which he doesn't know. Then we have a window. A small one. They went in 2 cars, Damien and Trick in one, Evelyn with 2 of her people in another. The hotel was a mid-range business property in the East 40s, the kind of place that catered to corporate travel and asked no meaningful questions. Trick had the room number from a contact inside the hotel's system who owed the Voss organization a favor of the type that hotel employees sometimes acquired. Room 814. Evelyn's people handled the hallway. Damien was clear on what this meant and what it said about whose operation this had become, and he accepted it without the resistance he would have felt 48 hours ago. Because 48 hours ago, he'd been operating on the assumption that he was the most significant force in any room he entered, and that assumption was no longer available to him. He knocked on the door of 814 himself. A pause from inside, then, "Who is it?" "Housekeeping," Damien said, which was not subtle and didn't need to be. Another pause. The kind of pause that is the sound of a man making calculations. Then the door opened. Connolly had decided, apparently, that not opening it was a worse option than opening it. And Damien looked at the face of the man he'd trusted with his political relationships for 7 years and felt something that wasn't quite anger, because anger would have been simpler. Connolly was 62 years old and had the look of a man whose careful management of his own effect had just failed him completely. His face was doing several things at once, none of them successfully. He saw Damien. He saw Trick behind Damien. He saw, past them, in the hallway, the 2 people who were clearly not hotel staff. "Damien," he said, as though this were a coincidence, as though they were running into each other somewhere unremarkable. "Step back," Damien said. They went inside. The room had the anonymous comfort of business travel, a desk, a bed, a window with a view of the building across the street. On the desk, a laptop, open. A phone, face up. A glass of water. The ordinary infrastructure of a man working through the evening. Damien looked at the laptop screen, a message thread partially visible, with a name at the top that confirmed what Evelyn had described in the warehouse. Connolly saw him look at it and reached for the laptop. Trick's hand was on his wrist before he got there. Very matter-of-fact, the kind of restraint that doesn't need to announce itself. "Sit down," Damien said. Connolly sat. He was doing something with his face that was the final performance of a man who'd built a career on managing appearances, trying to locate a version of this situation in which explanation was still a viable option. The trying was visible. The failure of the trying was visible underneath it. "How long?" Damien said. Connolly said nothing. "I'm not going to ask it twice tonight," Damien said. "I said that to someone else tonight, and I meant it then, too." 4 years, Connolly said. His voice had the flatness of a man who has just set something down that he's been carrying for a very long time. 4 years, roughly. "Who?" "The people I'm in contact with have... There are layers. I don't have direct contact with whoever is at the top of it. I deal with an intermediary." "Name?" "Marcus Vane." A pause. "He represents a group of investors. That's how they present themselves. Investors with interests in the reorganization of the Eastern Distribution Network." Damien had never heard the name Marcus Vane. He filed this. "What did they want from you?" "Information, initially, operational status, capacity, personnel. Then..." Connolly stopped, looked at his hands. "Then they wanted positioning. They wanted someone who could influence your decisions in certain directions. Certain partnerships that didn't happen because I managed the introductions badly. Certain alliances that dissolved because I shaped your read of the people involved." He looked up. There was something in his face that was almost grotesquely the beginning of an attempt at dignity. "I never wanted anyone hurt." "Brennan's house," Damien said. The dignity collapsed. "That wasn't... I told Vane's intermediary where Brennan was because I was asked. I didn't know they were going to..." He stopped. The stopping said everything the words were trying to avoid. "You knew the temperature of what you were involved in," Damien said. "You knew what kind of people give 4 years of consideration to reorganizing a criminal distribution network, and you gave them Brennan's location." Connolly had nothing left to put in the space where a response should go. Damien looked at him for a moment. Just looked. He'd been in rooms with a lot of different kinds of men over the course of his life in this business, and he'd developed a reasonably accurate read of what people were made of underneath the surfaces they maintained. What Connolly was made of, he understood now, was the ordinary human material of someone who'd found a financial incentive large enough to override other considerations, who told himself for 4 years the small, iterative lies that people tell themselves when they're making choices they know are wrong, and who was sitting now in the wreckage of those choices with the stunned expression of someone who'd known intellectually that the wreckage was coming but hadn't made it real until it arrived. It was not an uncommon story. It was not an interesting story. It was, however, a story that had put fire to a building where Brennan's children slept. He was about to speak when Evelyn's voice came from the doorway behind him. He hadn't heard her come in, which he noted with the part of his mind that kept running the tactical inventory regardless of everything else. She had moved through a space in which people were watching without making any of them register her arrival. This was, he was beginning to understand, a thing she was genuinely capable of, rather than a thing she occasionally managed. "Marcus Vane," she said. She was looking at Connolly with an expression that was absolutely, completely still. Connolly looked at her. Recognition moved through his face, not of a person he'd met, but of something he'd been told about. Whatever he'd been told, it made his posture change in a way that was involuntary and unmistakable. "You know that name," Damien said to her. "Yes." She crossed the room and looked at the laptop screen, at the message thread Damien had seen when they came in. She read it in a few seconds. "Vane doesn't represent investors," she said. "He represents the Korath Group, which is a name you won't have heard because they operate at a level that predates most of the structures you're familiar with." She turned from the laptop and looked at Damien, and he saw for the first time that night something that was not composure. Not quite. something that was composure being maintained at a cost. They're the ones who killed my father. The room received this. The Chicago collapse, Damien said. Was not a collapse, she said. It was a dismantling. My father was being extracted from his own organization by people who wanted the network without the man attached to it. He found out too late what was happening. She paused. I was 23. I'd been working with his operation for 2 years. I watched it happen, and I couldn't stop it. And he died in a car accident that was not an accident, and I spent the next several years building something that could... She stopped, reorganized. Building something that could see them coming next time. And you married me, Damien said slowly. Because your network abutted theirs in 3 places, she said. Because being inside your organization gave me visibility I couldn't get from the outside. Because I could monitor their movement through your operation's contact surface without them knowing I was watching. She held his gaze. And because of the other reason I told you about. Both things were true simultaneously. People are capable of that. He thought about what that meant. Thought about it from the inside out. Not the betrayal of it, or not only the betrayal, but the weight of carrying something like that for 3 years. Sitting across a breakfast table with information that no one else in the room had. Going to 400 events and smiling at people who didn't know what they were smiling at. Sleeping beside a man who didn't see her and using the invisibility as operational cover, and also, apparently, finding it painful enough that when he handed her a clean exit, she took it. They've been using Connolly to watch you, she said. But that's not the primary objective. The primary objective is me. They've known for some time that I was monitoring them. They don't know the extent. But they know enough to want me exposed, destabilized, drawn into a visible conflict. She looked at Connolly again. That's what you've been building toward for 4 years, not taking Damien's organization, using Damien's organization to flush me out. Connolly said nothing. The nothing was a confirmation. And the night at the gala, Damien said. He heard his own voice from a slight distance, the specific sound of a person assembling a structure they don't entirely want to finish. Did they? I don't know. She said, again, I told you I don't know. What I know is that Vane's group had been watching your marriage for 2 years, and that certain information about your relationship found its way into their communications, and that 4 months ago their internal traffic showed a significant uptick in interest in the timeline of our... She stopped. In when I might leave. He stood in the middle of a hotel room in Midtown Manhattan, with a laptop showing his former political director's communications with the people who had killed Evelyn's father. And he understood, with a completeness that felt almost physical, the full shape of what had been built around him without his knowledge. Not just the veil beneath his organization, not just Connolly's 4-year leak. The whole architecture, the arrangement that had placed Evelyn beside him, the monitoring that had turned his marriage into a surveillance operation, the patience of people who had been willing to wait years for the right confluence of circumstances to move against both of them simultaneously. He thought he was in a crisis of his own making. He was in a crisis that had been designed around him. What do they want? He said. They want the Veil's network exposed, Evelyn said. They want my contacts, my infrastructure, my coordinating systems. They want what my father built and what I've spent 11 years expanding, and they want it without the person who runs it, the same way they took his organization without him. She paused. And they want it now because they believe that with Connolly inside your operation and the 3 families aligned, and your organization sufficiently destabilized, and with you and I separated and the public narrative of your marriage's failure already established, they believe they have everything positioned. Do they? Damien said. She looked at him. Do they have it positioned? He said. She was quiet for a moment that stretched across the room with a weight he could measure. Then she said, they're missing one variable. Which is? They didn't account for the possibility that you'd find me before the window closed. They built the operation on the assumption that you'd spend these 2 weeks trying to manage the deterioration of your organization through your existing channels, not knowing which of them were compromised. They assumed pride, she said. Yours specifically. They assumed you'd rather lose everything than ask for help from the woman you publicly dismissed. He absorbed this. And I, she said, didn't account for the possibility that you'd find me and sit down and listen rather than escalate. She paused. I also underestimated the timeline. I thought I had another week before they moved to the direct phase. Brennan's house tonight tells me I was wrong. What's the direct phase? She looked at him with the expression he was coming to recognize as the one she wore when she was about to say something she would rather not say. They're going to try to take me, she said. Not kill me. Take me. The network can't be extracted the same way my father's was. I built it differently, with that specifically in mind. To access it, they need me operational and cooperative, which means her phone made a sound. She looked at it. Her face did something he hadn't seen it do all night. They're already moving, she said. And then the lights in the hotel went out, all of them, floor by floor in a sequence they could hear through the walls. And in the sudden dark of room 814, with the city's ambient glow coming through the window, Damien heard, from somewhere below them in the building, the sound of a stairwell door opening with the particular force of people who are not trying to be. Darkness hit the floor like a physical thing. Not the gradual dark of a power fluctuation, but the absolute dark of a deliberate cut. Every light source in the building gone simultaneously, the digital displays on the room's thermostat and smoke detector blinking out in the same instant, which meant someone had accessed the building's primary electrical panel rather than just tripping a breaker. Professional, planned. The kind of preparation that required inside knowledge of the building's infrastructure or enough time and money to acquire it from the outside. Damien moved before he'd consciously decided to move. 3 years of operational instinct didn't wait for his brain to finish processing. He was already sideways from where he'd been standing, putting the wall at his back, when Evelyn's hand found his arm in the dark with a precision that suggested she'd already mapped the room in terms of threat geometry without appearing to do so. "Window side," she said. Her voice was barely above breath. He moved with her. Behind them, he heard Trick's weight shift. The man had his own instincts, and they were currently directing him toward the door in a way Damien recognized from years of watching him work. From below, through the floor and the walls, came the sound he'd half-registered at the end of Evelyn's sentence. A stairwell door, the particular heavy metal sound of a fire door opened with purpose, and then the muffled cadence of multiple sets of feet on stairs moving upward at a controlled pace. Not running. Moving with the deliberate rhythm of people who've been told where they're going and don't need to hurry because they've already accounted for exits. "How many floors up are we?" Evelyn said. 8, he said. "They'll have the stairwells covered and the elevator shafts monitored. The roof is accessible from—" She stopped. In the ambient light from the window, the city's ambient glow, pink and gray, the permanent half-light of Manhattan at night, he could see her profile. She was looking at her phone. Not a call. Something else. A map or a schematic. He didn't ask where she'd gotten a schematic of the hotel, because the answer was clearly that she had resources he wasn't going to inventory right now. "Service corridor on the east side of the building," she said. "Connects to the freight elevator. The freight elevator runs on a separate electrical circuit." She looked up from the phone. "Probably. It's older infrastructure, which means it may not have been on the same grid they cut." "May not," he said. "That's what I said." Connolly was still in the chair. Damien could see his shape, pale and very still. A man who had spent 4 years feeding information to people who were currently in this building and who was understanding, perhaps for the first time at the level below abstraction, what that meant when translated into physical reality. "Can he walk?" Trick said from near the door. His voice was the voice he used in operational situations, stripped of everything except information transfer. "He'll walk," Damien said. He crossed to Connolly, put a hand on his shoulder, and pressed down in a way that was simultaneously a direction and a warning. "You're going to stay directly behind me, and you're not going to make a sound that I haven't authorized. Whatever you owe these people ends tonight. Whatever you think they'll do for you ends tonight. Do you understand that?" Connolly said, quietly, "Yes." "Then get up." He got up. Evelyn was already at the door. She opened it 2 inches, stopped, listened. Then she looked back at the room and held up 3 fingers, pointed left, held up 1 finger, pointed right. 4 people in the hallway, 3 one direction, 1 the other. Damien looked at Trick, who nodded once with the minimal efficiency of someone who'd processed and accepted a tactical situation. Then Evelyn opened the door all the way and moved into the hallway with a directness that briefly stopped Damien's breathing. because it was not the movement of someone trying to avoid confrontation, but the movement of someone who had decided that the corridor between her and the freight elevator contained obstacles rather than threats, and was acting accordingly. What happened in the next 40 seconds happened faster than Damien could fully sequence in real time, which was a thing that happened in actual violent situations and which movies had never accurately represented in his experience. Evelyn's two people, the ones who'd been positioned in the hallway when they had arrived, materialized from the near stairwell door in a timing that suggested coordination he hadn't witnessed being arranged, which meant she'd communicated it through a means he hadn't observed, which meant her operational communication ran through channels invisible to him even at close range. The single individual to the right of the door was handled before he'd finished turning. The three to the left were a different calculation, and Trick was already in it alongside Evelyn's people, and Damien put himself between Connolly and the wall and watched the condensed, efficient violence of people who were very good at this working against people who were also good at it, but had expected to find the corridor clear. It lasted under a minute. It was loud in ways that would register 2 floors in either direction. It left 2 of the 4 people from the hallway conscious and mobile, and the other 2 in positions that would require significant time and medical attention to resolve. "Move," Evelyn said. They moved. The service corridor was at the end of a passage behind the housekeeping station, accessible through a door marked with the universal symbol for maintenance that no guest of a mid-range business hotel ever thought twice about. Evelyn went through it like she'd used it before. The freight elevator was there, old enough that its controls were analog rather than digital, which meant the building's smart grid cut had left it operational on its backup circuit. The doors opened when she pressed the button. They went in. Evelyn, Damien, Trick, Connolly, one of Evelyn's 2 remaining people. The second had taken damage in the hallway that was significant enough that she'd been directed, briefly, to the stairwell with a set of instructions delivered in under 10 words. Damien didn't know what those instructions were. He had a feeling they would be followed regardless. "Where are we going?" he said as the freight elevator began its descent. "Not the lobby," Evelyn said. "Sub-basement, loading dock." "They'll have the building perimeter." "Yes." Then we go through rather than around." She was looking at her phone again, typing something with a speed that suggested a practice channel rather than a new contact. "I have a vehicle 2 blocks east. I need 4 minutes from the loading dock to reach it. You need 4 minutes in a 2-block radius with Vane's people on the perimeter." "Yes," she said, with the exact same inflection she used for obvious statements, which told him she understood what she was describing and had either accounted for it or decided to address it as it arrived. The freight elevator opened to the sub-basement with a mechanical complaint that echoed badly in the concrete space. Loading dock. A large flat area with 2 truck bays currently dark, the ambient light from the dock's exterior panels seeping under the rolling bay doors and providing just enough visibility to move by. The smell down here was rubber and industrial cleaner, and the faint iron note that big city loading docks carried from decades of freight and human activity. Evelyn went to the smaller of the 2 bay doors, not the main ones, a side access, and stopped at it without touching the handle. She was listening. So was Trick. So was Damien. The loading dock sounds from outside, the low-grade noise of the street, a truck idling somewhere to the west, the city's ambient frequency under everything. And underneath that, barely, footsteps, positioned. Not moving, which was worse than moving because it meant someone was standing in a predetermined location rather than patrolling, which meant the position had been thought through. 2, Trick said. "At least," Evelyn said. Damien looked at the bay door. 2 minutes, maybe less, before whoever had been in the stairwells understood the elevator had moved and started doing the math about where it had gone. The window for this exit was contracting in real time, and everyone in the loading dock understood that simultaneously. "Connolly," Damien said. The man looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been waiting to be addressed and was not looking forward to what the address contained. "You said you deal with an intermediary," Damien said. "Not Vane directly. Is the intermediary in this building tonight?" Connolly's eyes moved in a way that told Damien the answer before the words did. "He was coordinating from a room on the 6th floor, he said. "He arrived this afternoon." "Name?" Trent. Gary Trent. Damien looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. The exchange lasted 2 seconds and contained a complete tactical conversation about leverage and timing and the specific value of a frightened intermediary as a communications channel to the people outside the building who were waiting for instructions from the 6th floor. Evelyn turned to Trick. Can you reach the 6th floor without the stairwells? Trick thought for exactly 1 second. The service shaft has a ladder access, he said. I saw it near the elevator. Goes all the way up. Gary Trent, she said. Room 614. He answers to Vane. Tell him the person he came here to acquire would like to discuss terms, and tell him she's watching the loading dock, and if his people move in the next 10 minutes, she'll be gone before they breach, and he'll have to explain to Vane why he had her and lost her. She paused. Can you say it exactly like that? Yes, Trick said. Go. Trick went. His footsteps on the concrete were almost nothing. The man moved with a density that seemed disproportionate to his sound output, a skill Damien had observed for years and never entirely gotten used to. Damien looked at Evelyn. And if Trent decides the better option is to have his people breach anyway, then we breach the door simultaneously and go through the two outside rather than waiting, she said. It's a worse option. It has a higher probability of someone getting hurt. She looked at him directly. But it's available. You think he'll hold? Trent is a coordinator, she said. He does what he's told. The value of what he's been told to do tonight is contingent on delivering me intact and operational. If I'm gone, he has failed at the core objective, and the people he works for are not forgiving about that kind of failure. She paused. I know this because they weren't forgiving about it with my father, and my father was more valuable to them than Gary Trent. He absorbed this. Outside, the positioned footsteps hadn't moved. Inside, the sub-basement breathed its industrial breath around them. Connolly stood very still against the wall, a man whose existence had been reduced to witness, and Evelyn's remaining operative had positioned herself near the main bay doors, with the patient alertness of someone waiting for a signal. 4 minutes passed, each one of them with its own weight. Then Trick was back, moving faster than he'd left, which communicated something before he said anything. Trent said yes, he said. The people outside the dock door have been told to hold position. He paused. He also said Vane wants to speak to her directly. Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Now? Damien said. Vane's not in the building, Trick said. He's remote. Trent has a secure line. He's offering 5 minutes. Evelyn looked at Damien. There was something in the look that was asking a question he hadn't expected. Not a tactical question. Something else. Something about whether he was willing to stand in a loading dock and listen to a conversation with the man responsible for her father's death conducted over a stranger's phone, and trust her to run it without explaining every move in advance. He held her gaze. Do it, he said. She took the phone Trick was holding out, Trent's phone, relayed down from the 6th floor through means he didn't ask about, and she held it to her ear and she said, in a voice that was absolutely level, Vane. Damien could hear the response as a texture, not as words. A male voice, controlled, the timbre of someone accustomed to being on the far end of decisions. She listened for 20 seconds without speaking, her face doing nothing, and then she said, No. Another texture from the phone. No, she said again. Here's what I'm offering. One time, no negotiation. You pull your people from this building and from the perimeter tonight, and you don't move on any Voss-affiliated location for 30 days. In 30 days, I'll contact you directly through a channel I'll specify, and we'll have a different conversation about what a mutual arrangement looks like going forward. She paused. Or you instruct your people to come through the loading dock door right now, and we can find out which of us has more to lose in the next 10 minutes. The voice on the phone. I know you killed my father, she said. The voice didn't change. I've known for 6 years. I've been building toward a specific conversation with you for 6 years. Tonight is not that conversation because tonight is not the right conditions. But I want you to understand that the fact that I'm offering you 30 days instead of what I actually intend is a function of timing, not of forgiveness. Don't mistake it. Silence from the phone. 30 days, she said. Yes or no? A pause, then a texture that Damien read from her face as affirmative. She handed the phone back to Trick. She looked at Damien. "We have a window," she said. "It's real, but it's not long. He'll honor 30 days because he needs time to reposition, and 30 days gives him that. It gives us the same thing." "The 30 days are real," he said. "For both of us," she said. "And after 30 days? After 30 days is a different problem." She moved toward the dock door. "Right now we need to be 2 blocks east." The door opened to cold air and the smell of the city at night, and 2 men who stepped back from the door with the careful neutrality of professionals who've been told to stand down and are doing so without pleasure. Damien walked past them and felt the specific weight of that, of moving through space that should have been hostile and finding it, through Evelyn's intervention, passable. The sensation was not comfort. It was the recognition of a shift in the order of things, and who was standing, where and why, that had implications he'd need to sit with later. The vehicle was where she said it was, a dark SUV, engine running, the driver someone she knew. They got in. The city moved past the windows. Connolly was in the rear seat making himself geometrically small. Trick was watching the side mirror. Evelyn was looking at her phone and then looking out the window and then looking at her phone again. And Damien watched her do this and thought about all the rooms she'd moved through over the last 11 years that he had no access to. All the decisions made in spaces he'd never been invited into. The architecture of something vast and invisible built over a decade of patience and concealed capability. He thought about his father telling him that the most dangerous people in any room were the ones who didn't need you to know they were dangerous. He thought about a dove-gray dress and a smile that had contained nothing he recognized. They went to a building in Brooklyn that he'd never been to, an industrial conversion in Red Hook, 4 blocks from the pier where they'd been 2 hours earlier. Evelyn's people had the space, had apparently had it for some time, and the infrastructure inside was different from what the exterior suggested. Clean, organized, the kind of operational base that had been set up by someone who understood the relationship between concealment and function. There were communications equipment and secure terminals and 3 people who moved around the space with the quiet competence of a team that had been working together long enough that they didn't need to narrate their actions. Damien stood in the center of it and looked at what 3 years of living beside this woman had not prepared him to see. Brennan arrived 20 minutes later, still carrying the weight of the evening on his face, but functional in the way he'd said he would be. He looked at the room, at Evelyn's setup, at the people moving through it, and then he looked at Damien with an expression that was complex enough to have several things happening in layers. "Sit down," Damien said. They sat at a table near the communications bank. Damien, Brennan, Evelyn, and Trick. And Evelyn laid out what she knew about the Korath group's positioning in a way that was detailed and organized and took 12 minutes without notes, which meant she'd been carrying it in working memory, which told him how long she'd been actively tracking it. The picture she drew was extensive. The Korath group was not an organization in the conventional sense. It was a network of financial and logistical interests that had been using criminal distribution networks as infrastructure for a generation, inserting control mechanisms into organizations like Damien's through long-term relationship cultivation and information leverage. The Voss syndicate had been a target for 4 years since Connolly's recruitment, but Damien's organization was secondary. He understood this as she spoke. He was the platform they needed to access something larger. "They want the Veils routing network," she said. "Not the personnel, not the political relationships, the routing. The way information and resources move between organizations that nominally don't know about each other. It's the connective tissue. It's what my father built and what I've expanded, and it's worth more to them than any individual organization because it gives them visibility into everything that uses it." "And if they get it," Brennan said. "They see everything," she said simply. "Every supply chain, every financial mechanism, every communication between organizations that runs through the Veils infrastructure. They'd have a map of the entire Underworld's nervous system." "And they'd sell that," Trick said. "Or use it," she said. "Both. Either. The specific application matters less than the access." Damien said, "What do you need?" She looked at him. "To stop them," he said. "Not in 30 days. The 30 days is a window. I'm asking what happens inside the window." "I need to expose the Korath group's ownership structure," she said. "There are people, federal people, and people in the international financial regulatory system, who've been building a case against this group for years without being able to connect the operational activity to the ownership layer. If I give them the connection, the group loses the protection that's kept it functional. Legal exposure at that level is more effective than anything we can do directly. You give federal authorities information about a criminal network, Damien said. About this specific criminal network, yes. And your own network. My network is not what they're looking for, she said. The Veil's function is coordination and stability, not the kind of direct criminal activity that federal prosecution requires. She paused. It's not entirely clean. I'm not going to tell you it is, but it's not what they're building a case around. And my organization. She looked at him with the expression that she'd worn at the Aldine when she'd asked him for honesty. That depends on decisions you make in the next 30 days, she said. He understood what she was saying. He looked at Brennan, who was looking at the table. He looked at Trick, who was looking at Damien with the expression he always wore when he was waiting to see which direction things were going to go, so he could go there too. He looked at Connolly, sitting against the far wall, who was looking at nothing in particular because there was nothing particular left for him to look at. Damien thought about 30% operational capacity. He thought about 7 years of Connolly's careful, invisible management of decisions that had seemed like Damien's own. He thought about the Newark crates, the dark phones, the senator who'd backed away. He thought about an organization that had been built on his father's machine and his grandfather's dream, and that had been, for the last 4 years, at least partially operated by people whose interests were not his. He thought about what Evelyn had said at the Aldine. They assume pride. Yours, specifically. He looked at her. Tell me what you need from my end, he said, for the exposure, what you need from the Voss side of it. Something happened in her face, not the composure breaking. That wasn't what it was. Something underneath the composure moving, a small internal seismic event that didn't reach the surface entirely, but was visible in the way that things visible only in peripheral vision were visible. Then it was gone, and she was already moving into the operational detail of what she needed, and Damien was already listening, and the room was working, and the 30-day window had officially begun. 12 days into the window, the Marchetti family made its move. It came not through the channels Damien had been watching, not through the distribution network, or the political contacts, or the financial structures, but directly at the physical level, in the form of 6 men who arrived at the warehouse in Queens that housed the last functioning operational center of the Voss Syndicate's Eastern network. Damien got the alert at 2 in the morning from a sensor system that Evelyn's people had installed in the building's perimeter at his request, or more accurately, at her suggestion delivered as a resource offer, which he had accepted without the resistance he would have felt 2 weeks earlier. He was there in 19 minutes. Evelyn was there in 17, which told him she'd been closer to begin with, or that her driver was better, and he didn't ask which. The warehouse situation was not a siege, it was an assessment. The 6 Marchetti people had breached the perimeter but hadn't entered the main structure, which meant they were there to establish presence rather than take action, which meant someone had told them to make a visible move without committing to a final one. It was a message. The message was, the window is not as secure as you believe. Damien stood outside the warehouse in the February cold, with his breath visible and his phone in his hand, and Brennan beside him and Evelyn 2 steps back and said, "They're going to keep doing this." "Yes," Evelyn said. "The 30 days aren't real." "Not for the Marchettis, no. Vane controls the Korath group. He doesn't control the Marchetti family directly. He can instruct them to hold, but they have their own interests in the destabilization of your organization, and those interests don't pause because Vane made a phone call. So we have 28 days on the Korath front and 0 days on the Marchetti front. Approximately." He looked at the warehouse. Somewhere inside, his people were doing what they always did in situations like this, waiting for direction, managing their fear with the professional discipline of people who'd chosen a life where fear was a workplace condition rather than an emergency. He thought about Marco Selene, who still wasn't taking his calls. He thought about the captains who'd gone dark. He thought about what it meant to lead an organization from a 30% position against a family that had no reason to wait, and every reason to move while moving was advantageous. The Salter organization, he said, and the Renfield network. They're aligned with the Marchettis in this. Yes. All three move together. If the Marchettis commit, she said, the other two follow within hours. It's been choreographed. He turned to look at her. In the cold and the dark outside the warehouse, with the city's light scattered across the low cloud cover and Brennan's breath making small clouds beside him and 6 hostile people doing whatever they were doing inside his perimeter, he looked at the woman who was the most powerful criminal coordinator in the country and asked the question that the last 2 weeks had been building toward. If we take this to them before they take it to us, he said, before the Marchettis commit the other two, if we hit the point of coordination, not the families, the coordination mechanism, the thing that's keeping them aligned, what does that look like? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The cold moved between them. It looks like a meeting, she said. The 3 families have a coordination point, a physical location where their representatives convene when they need to align on a major action. I know where it is because I've known about it for 3 years, and I've been deciding what to do with the information. She paused. It's a warehouse in the Navy Yard. They'll be there in 4 days, based on the communication pattern I've been tracking. When all 3 commit to the Marchetti move, they'll need a final in-person alignment before they execute. 4 days, he said. 4 days. And if we're there when they are, then we have one chance to disrupt the coordination at the source before the execution begins, she said. It's not a clean option. It's not without significant risk to people on our side, but it's the option that stops all 3 families simultaneously instead of responding to each of them sequentially after they've already moved. He looked at Brennan. Brennan looked back at him with the face of a man who'd had his house set on fire 12 days ago and who had, since that night, been running on a specific kind of fuel that was going to need resolution one way or another. How many people do you have who can move on 4 days' preparation? Damien said to Evelyn. She looked at him steadily. Enough, she said, if yours are added to mine. He held her gaze in the cold outside the warehouse, with everything that had happened between them and everything that hadn't been said, and the 6 Marchetti people doing their slow territorial mathematics inside his perimeter, and he made the decision that 2 weeks ago he wouldn't have been capable of making because 2 weeks ago he still believed that the only sustainable position was the one at the top of every room he entered. Then we go together, he said. The Navy Yard came 4 days later, at night, in the cold, with a coordination between his people and hers that felt unfamiliar and necessary and nothing like what either of them had built independently. The target was a converted warehouse on the yard's south end, a building that looked from the outside like every other industrial structure in the complex, and that contained on the inside a meeting already in progress. Representatives of 3 families, a coordination session that Evelyn's people had confirmed was happening through channels he still didn't fully understand and had decided not to interrogate. They went in through 3 entry points simultaneously. What happened inside happened fast and loud, and at the kind of physical intensity that stripped everything down to its most essential components, where your feet were, where the threat was, what was between you and the next position. Damien moved through it with the adrenaline doing what adrenaline always did, narrowing the world to the immediate, making the body faster than the mind, turning the accumulated debris of the last 3 weeks into something clean and present and physical. He took a hit to the ribs from a man twice his size who came through a side door that hadn't been on the schematic, and the pain was specific and breathtaking, and he registered it and kept moving because stopping wasn't available. He heard Brennan somewhere to his left. He heard sounds from the building's east side that he recognized as Evelyn's people working in the way they worked. Efficiently, with minimal noise given the circumstances. The way you work when you've been trained by someone who understood that violence was occasionally a tool, but never a performance. The meeting broke. The coordination collapsed. 3 family representatives found themselves in positions that made the next 30 days of planning functionally impossible without a rebuilding process that would take considerably longer than 30 days. It wasn't a win in the complete sense. Wins in the complete sense, Damien had learned enough by now to know, were a narrative convenience rather than an operational reality. It was a disruption. It was enough. He found Evelyn near the building's east exit when it was over, her coat dark with something he chose not to examine in the poor light, her breathing controlled in the deliberate way of someone who has just needed it to be very controlled and is maintaining the discipline into the aftermath. There was a cut above her left eye that was doing what cuts on faces do, and she was pressing the back of her hand against it with an expression that treated the injury as an administrative problem rather than an emergency. He crossed to her. She looked up at him. Around them, the warehouse was doing the settling that buildings do after human violence has moved through them, the specific acoustic quality of a space that has just been very loud and is now very quiet. He looked at the cut. He looked at her face. He thought about the Aldine, the small room, the 2 chairs, the wine she hadn't drunk. He thought about the loading dock in the dark, and the 30-day window, and the 4 days of preparation that had looked like trust being built in real time, piece by piece, under conditions that didn't allow for the luxury of taking it slowly. He reached into his jacket for the folded cloth he kept there, a handkerchief, an old habit his father had drilled into him, one of the few things from that inheritance that had survived, and he held it out to her. She took it, pressed it against the cut, looked at him. "There are still people coming," she said. Her voice was level, but underneath the level was something that was not quite exhaustion, but was aware of it. Vane, the Korath group. The 30 days was real, but what comes after it is going to require— "I know," he said. "The federal exposure, the documentation, there's still—" "I know," he said again. She stopped talking, looked at him with an expression that had in it, very far down, the question she hadn't asked since the Aldine. The one about what this was, what they were doing, and whether they were doing it together or beside each other, which were different things, and whether the difference mattered and to whom. He didn't have a clean answer. He had the answer that was available in a damaged warehouse in the Brooklyn Navy Yard with blood on her face and his ribs making their complaint felt with every breath, which was that he was here and so was she, and whatever came next was going to require both of them to be something neither of them had managed to be in 3 years of marriage. "Can we get out of this building?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then let's do that first," he said, "and then we'll talk about what comes." They talked in the car. Not about the warehouse, not about the cut above her eye, which had stopped bleeding by the time they reached the vehicle, leaving a dried line on her face that she didn't touch and he didn't mention. Not about the ribs, which were telling him with increasing specificity that at least one of them was cracked, and that the next several weeks were going to involve a category of discomfort that didn't allow for forgetting. They talked about what came next because what came next was the thing that would determine whether the Navy Yard had been a turning point or simply a delay, and neither of them was built for the kind of silence that mistakes recovery for resolution. "The documentation," Damien said. "The connection between Korath's ownership structure and their operational activity. How close is it?" "Close," Evelyn said. "I've been building the file for 6 years. What I've been missing is the financial thread, the layer that connects the holding companies to the actual decision makers. Without it, the file shows a pattern, but not a proof. Pattern isn't enough for the kind of exposure that actually dismantles something." "Where's the thread?" "Connolly has it," she said, "or access to it. Vane's intermediary, Trent, ran the financial coordination for the Eastern operations. 4 years of communication with Connolly means 4 years of financial instruction. If Connolly kept records—" "He kept records," Damien said. He said it with the certainty of someone who'd employed Connolly for 7 years and understood the man's fundamental nature, which was the nature of someone who accumulated leverage the way other people accumulated furniture, not because he had an immediate use for it, but because having it felt safer than not having it. He kept everything. "Then I need to talk to him." "I know." They went to the safe house in Carroll Gardens where Connolly had been held since the hotel, under the watch of one of Brennan's people, and in a condition that was not physically uncomfortable, but was also not optional. It was 3 a.m. The building was quiet with the specific quiet of a place where someone has been awake for a very long time without anything to do except think about what they've done. Connolly looked up when they came in. He looked at Evelyn's face, the dried cut, the coat, the overall quality of a person who had recently been somewhere requiring a specific kind of effort, and something in his expression collapsed a further increment. He was 62 years old and had been in a room alone for 12 days, and the architecture of his face showed it. The careful management of affect that had made him functional in his role was mostly gone. What was left was the substrate, A man who was tired and frightened and had been carrying the weight of a bad decision compounded daily for 4 years, and who wanted, in the way that people want things when they've run out of alternatives, to put it down. Evelyn sat across from him. Damien stood near the door. "The financial records," she said. "Trent's instructions. The transaction authorizations that connect to the Korath holding structure. You have them." Connolly looked at her for a long moment. His hands were on his knees. "If I give you those," he said, "and you use them the way I think you intend to use them, there's nothing left for me afterward. Whatever protection—" "There's no protection," she said. "There hasn't been protection since the hotel. The people you were working for don't protect failures, and you know that because you've watched them operate for 4 years. What there is this. You give me what I need, and I don't make the decision about what happens to you. Damien does. And you've worked for Damien for 7 years, which means you understand what that calculus looks like better than I do." Connolly looked at Damien. Damien looked back at him. He thought about 7 years. He thought about the partnerships that hadn't happened, and the alliances that had dissolved, and the decisions he'd believed were his own. He thought about Brennan's house. He thought about 2 children who'd been in a building when it caught fire, and who were currently at their aunt's house in New Jersey, and who would carry some version of that night for the rest of their lives. He thought about all of it, and he said, "Give her what she needs." Connolly nodded, once, slowly, the way decisions get made when the deciding has already been done and the motion is just the body catching up. The records were in a cloud storage account accessible through an encrypted application on a phone Connolly had kept separate from everything the Voss organization knew about. The private infrastructure of a man covering his own position, exactly as Damien had predicted. It took 40 minutes to access and transfer the relevant files to Evelyn's system. During those 40 minutes, the room was very quiet, and Damien watched Connolly's hands work the phone with the methodical care of someone performing a task they know is the last task. And he felt something he didn't have a clean name for. Not forgiveness, not absolution. Something more like the recognition that people make choices that become structures that become prisons. And that the only thing that could be said about Connolly's particular prison was that he had built it himself, which made it more honest than most. At 4:15 in the morning, Evelyn sat back from the laptop she'd been using and said, "It's enough." Damien looked at her. "Enough for what, exactly?" "Enough to collapse the Korath Group's operational protection in 3 jurisdictions," she said. "The financial thread connects 9 holding companies to 4 individuals whose names appear in existing federal investigations as persons of interest. What's been missing is the transactional proof that places them in the decision chain. This is the proof." She paused. "When I give this to the right people, and I know who the right people are, I've been cultivating those relationships for years. The investigation moves from persons of interest to indictment candidates within months. The Korath Group loses its legal cover. Without legal cover, the network loses the financial infrastructure that makes it functional. Without the financial infrastructure, Marcus Vane is running an organization that can't sustain itself." "And Vane personally," Damien said. "Vane is one of the 9 names in the connection," she said. "He's the most careful of them, which means the chain of evidence is thinner for him than for the others. He may survive the initial round of prosecution." She looked at Damien steadily. "He won't survive the second round. I'll make sure of that." He heard what was underneath the statement. It was not a legal mechanism she was describing for the second round. He didn't ask her to elaborate. The next 3 weeks were the kind of work that didn't look like work from the outside. Meetings in places that didn't record meetings, conversations that went through secure channels, and left no trace in the systems that traces normally lived in, the careful transfer of information to people who knew how to receive it without contaminating its evidentiary value. Evelyn ran this process with a precision that Damien observed at close range and found alternately remarkable and humbling, which was a combination of reactions he hadn't expected to be capable of having about anyone. He ran his own parallel process. The Voss Syndicate, at 30% capacity, was not a viable long-term structure. He'd understood this since Walsh had given him the number in the parking garage, and he'd been thinking about what viable looked like ever since. The thinking had produced something he would not have produced 6 weeks earlier, because 6 weeks earlier his frame of reference for viable was different. It involved staying the same thing, but larger, more protected, more consolidated. The frame of reference he had now was different in ways he was still mapping. He called Marco Cellini, who had stopped taking his calls 7 weeks ago. Marco picked up on the third ring. "I know why you went dark," Damien said. "I'm not calling about that. I'm calling because I need people who understand what the organization was, and I need them to help me build what it's going to be, which is different. And I need you to tell me if that's something you can be part of. And if not, I need to know that too." A long silence from Marco's end. Then, "What's different about it?" "We're moving legitimate revenue to the front," Damien said. "Not as cover, as the actual primary operation. The distribution network, what's left of it, gets restructured. Some of it goes legal, some of it gets terminated. The parts that stay in the gray zone stay there because they serve functions that don't have clean replacements yet, not because I need them for their own sake." Another silence. "You're talking about dismantling the core." "I'm talking about rebuilding around a different core," Damien said. "Yeah. Why?" He thought about how to answer this honestly without it sounding like the kind of thing people said when they'd been through something hard and wanted to dress it up as wisdom. "Because the thing I built the old way turned out to have a foundation I didn't build," he said, "and I'm not interested in building on someone else's foundation again." Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll come in, but I'm going to need to know what I'm walking into before I'm in it." "I'll tell you everything," Damien said. "That's different too." The Korath Group's legal exposure broke open 8 weeks after the Navy Yard, which was faster than Evelyn had projected and which meant the file had been more complete than she'd estimated, or the federal relationship she'd cultivated had been more motivated than she'd expected, or both. The news of it arrived through channels that ordinary people accessed: financial press, investigative journalism, the specific slow-moving avalanche of a major prosecution becoming publicly visible as it moved from the investigative phase to the charging phase. 4 of the 9 names appeared in published indictments. Vane's name did not appear in the first round, as Evelyn had predicted. Damien read about it in his office on a Tuesday morning in the building in Midtown that still housed the legitimate face of what the Voss operation was becoming, which was changing enough from what it had been that the word operation was starting to feel like it belonged to a previous version. He read it with a coffee going cold on the desk beside him and the sounds of the city coming through the window, and thought about a man named Gary Trent sitting in a room on the 6th floor of a Midtown hotel, being used as a relay for a phone call that had probably changed more things than Trent would ever know. He thought about a lot of things in those weeks that were not the kind of things he'd previously spent time thinking about, which was itself a kind of evidence about what the last 2 months had done to his internal architecture. Connolly entered a cooperation agreement with federal authorities that Pressman, Damien's lawyer, helped structure in exchange for terms that were not comfortable but were survivable. The terms required Connolly to relocate and reduce his profile in ways that were effectively a life sentence of obscurity, which Damien understood was its own kind of punishment for a man who'd spent 30 years managing the relationship between powerful people and their public faces. He didn't spend energy on whether it was the right outcome. It was the available outcome, and available was what he was working with. Brennan came back full-time 6 weeks after the Navy Yard, which was when his family returned from New Jersey. Karen Brennan, whom Damien had met perhaps a dozen times over 7 years, at the obligatory events where spouses appeared and performed the peripheral existence of people adjacent to a life they'd chosen by proximity rather than vocation, came into the Midtown office one afternoon unannounced and sat across from Damien and looked at him with the direct gaze of a woman who'd spent 6 weeks in her sister's house explaining to her children why they couldn't go home yet. "I need to know," she said, "that the next time something like this happens, there's a structure that keeps them out of it." "There won't be a next time like this," he said. "That's not the same as what I asked." He looked at her. She was right. And she knew she was right. And the fact that she was sitting in his office saying it to his face, rather than through Brennan, was its own kind of statement about what the fire had burned through. "The structure is changing," he said. "The work that put them in danger isn't the work we're doing anymore. I can't guarantee the world, but I can guarantee that." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, in the assessing way of someone who has learned to calibrate their trust carefully and precisely. Then she nodded, got up, left without further ceremony, which was the most Brennan thing anyone who'd married Brennan would do. He thought about that interaction for the rest of the day. Evelyn came to the Midtown office 4 times in those weeks, always with a purpose, always with the focused efficiency of someone who had many things requiring focus and was allocating it precisely. Each time she left, the room felt different after she'd been in it, a quality he'd apparently always noticed and simply filed incorrectly as the ordinary residue of another person's presence rather than as what it actually was, which was the specific texture that this person left in spaces she occupied. The 5th time she came, she didn't have a specific purpose. He was in the office late on a Thursday, later than he'd intended to stay, working through the restructuring documents that Walsh had been preparing for 3 weeks. The legal architecture of what the Voss operation was becoming, the entities being dissolved and the ones being transformed, and the new structures being built from the parts that could survive translation into something that could exist in daylight. The work was dense and detail-heavy, and he was good at it in the way he was good at most things that required sustained attention and a tolerance for complexity, and he'd lost track of the time in the way that happened when the work was absorbing. She knocked. He looked up. She was in the doorway with her coat over her arm and her hair down in the way she'd worn it on Sunday mornings, and the combination of those 2 things, the late hour and the hair, landed somewhere specific. "I was passing," she said. He looked at her. "That's not true," she said. "I wasn't passing. I wanted to see how it was going." He put the papers down. "Come in." She came in, looked at the documents on the desk, the stacks of restructuring work, the legal architecture spread across the surface. She picked up one page, read a section of it, set it back down. Her face was the face of someone reading something that confirms a thing they'd been told but hadn't yet seen in material form. "Walsh did this," she said. "Walsh and Pressman, together, which is—" He paused. "They don't usually work well together. They're making an effort. Because the work requires it. Because the work requires it." She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair Karen Brennan had sat in, the chair across from his that he'd spent years having conversations in that mattered, which made it a chair with a specific history. She sat in it with the quality of someone sitting in a room they used to know differently, feeling the overlap between the old version of the space and the current one. "Vane's going to run," she said. "When the second round of indictments moves, he'll know it's coming before it arrives. He has people in enough places to have early warning. He'll relocate to a jurisdiction without extradition arrangements, and he'll continue operating at a reduced scale." "And the second round," Damien said, "the one you said you'd make sure of." She met his eyes. "We'll follow him wherever he goes," she said. "Not through federal channels. The federal exposure removes his infrastructure. What removes Vane is a different mechanism." She held his gaze. "I want to be honest with you about what I mean when I say that. I know what you mean. I want to be sure you know." "Evelyn," he said, "I've been in this business my entire adult life. I know what you mean when you say a different mechanism. I'm not asking you to soften it." He paused. "What I'm saying is that it's yours to handle. I'm not going to be involved in it, and I'm not going to ask about it, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know it's happening." Another pause. "That's a line I'm drawing, not because I'm clean. I'm not clean, and we both know it. But because the thing I'm building now isn't built on that kind of foundation, and I need to maintain the distinction clearly, or the distinction stops existing." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the ambient noise of the building, the HVAC system, the distant sound of the elevator, the specific silence of a high floor in Midtown late at night, became audible between them. "That's a reasonable line," she said. "Thank you." "I'm not complimenting you," she said. "I'm telling you it's structurally reasonable. Complimenting you is a different thing." Something moved in his chest that was not the cracked rib, which had been healing at the rate that cracked ribs heal when you don't adequately rest them, which was slowly and with complaint. "Okay," he said. "You humiliated me in front of 400 people," she said. "Not because you were cruel, because you didn't see me. Because you'd spent 3 years not looking and assumed the absence of anything visible meant the absence of anything significant." She said it evenly, without inflection, in the way she'd said things throughout this entire period when she was being precise rather than emotional.
I need you to understand that I know the difference between what you've done in the last 8 weeks and that night. I know they're different things. And I also need you to understand that the difference doesn't undo the night. I know, he said. Do you? Yes. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to undo it. I know there isn't a version of this where I make the case that you should trust me again and you agree because I made a good argument. I know that's not what this is.
What I can tell you is what I understand now that I didn't understand then, and what I intend to do with that understanding, and then whatever you decide is what you decide. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city did its indifferent thing, the permanent low-grade roar of 8 million people going about their lives in the proximate dark. Tell me, she said. He thought about how to say it accurately, not in the way that sounded like what people said in these situations, because he'd sat across from enough people in enough difficult conversations to know the difference between a thing said because it was true and a thing said because it fit the shape of what the situation required. He wanted to say the true thing, which was harder and less coherent and didn't have the clean lines of a rehearsed statement. I spent 3 years living beside someone remarkable, he said, and treating remarkable like it was something that happened to other people. Not because I didn't have evidence, because I wasn't looking for evidence. I had a picture of what you were, and I kept the picture and ignored everything that didn't fit it, because fitting things into pictures is faster than seeing what's actually there. And I was... He stopped. Started again. I was running too fast to look at anything carefully, including myself. She was very still. The thing I did at the gala, he said, the way I did it, that wasn't strategy. That was a man who'd stopped seeing his own life and was making decisions in the gap where the seeing should have been. I can tell you it won't happen again, but you know that's not something I can guarantee because people don't guarantee their own blind spots. What I can tell you is that I know the blind spot exists now, and knowing it exists is different from not knowing. A long silence. She looked at the window. At the city lights beyond it, the specific geometry of Manhattan at night, the grid visible in the arrangement of lit windows and the intervals of dark between them. The veil is going to continue, she said. It's not an organization I can dismantle or retire from. It's a function. The work I do is a function that exists because it needs to exist, and if I didn't do it, someone less careful would. She looked back at him. That's not going to change. I know. And the work you're doing, the restructuring, the legitimate front, the line you're drawing, that's going to be real work. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be fast, and there are going to be decisions inside it that don't have clean answers. I know that too. And neither of those things is compatible with the version of this where we pretend the last 3 years were a misunderstanding and go back to what we were. We can't go back to what we were, he said. What we were didn't work, for either of us. She looked at him. He looked back at her. In the late quiet of the office, in the middle of the legal architecture of a thing he was building that was different from what he'd built before, and he waited for whatever she was deciding to resolve into whatever it was going to be. She reached into her coat pocket. She held out her hand, palm up, with the rose gold wedding band in the center of it. He looked at it. I've been carrying it since the gala, she said. I don't know what that means. I've been trying to figure out what that means for 8 weeks. He didn't reach for it immediately. He looked at her face instead, at the dried line of the cut that was almost healed, at the specific quality of composure that was not the performance of composure, but the actual thing, built from years of carrying weight that no one else could see. What did you decide? He said. I decided that carrying it was its own kind of answer, she said, and I'm done analyzing it. He reached out and took the ring from her palm. He turned it in his fingers for a moment, then he set it on the desk between them. Not yet, he said. She looked at him. Not because I don't want to, he said, because I want to do it right this time. Whatever right looks like, I want to take the time to find out. He met her eyes. Is that? Yes, she said, before he finished, with a quality of relief that was so carefully not displayed that its presence was visible precisely in the effort of not displaying it. They sat in the office for another hour after that, not working, not strategizing, not laying out the next phase of anything. He made coffee with the machine on the credenza that he'd had in every office for 15 years and that made acceptable coffee and nothing more. She took hers without anything in it, which he'd known, and which he hadn't realized he'd known until he handed it to her without asking. She talked about her father, not the death, not the organization, but the man, something she'd evidently never done in 3 years of marriage, because 3 years of marriage had been a version of herself that kept certain rooms closed. He listened without filling the space she left in it, which was something he'd also had to learn, and was still learning. She talked about Switzerland, about the 14 months that Patel had found difficult to account for, about what it had looked like to build something from a foundation of grief at 23, with the understanding that grief was a terrible foundation, but also sometimes the only one available. He told her about his father, the real version, not the organizational mythology, the man who'd taught him to sit down deliberately in rooms and who'd also been absent for most of his childhood in the specific way that men with empires were absent, and who'd died before Damien had figured out how to have a conversation with him that wasn't about the business. The thing he'd been trying to outrun by running the business harder, and what had happened when the running didn't work. Outside, the city moved through its night. The hour hand moved past midnight, and neither of them marked it. At some point, she said, "The Marchetti family is going to need to be addressed, not violently. The Navy Yard disruption held them back, but it didn't resolve the underlying—" "I know," he said. "I have a meeting with their representative next week. Walsh is coming with me." "Not Brennan. Walsh. It's a financial conversation. The Marchettis want assurance that the restructuring doesn't affect the distribution relationship in ways that make them vulnerable. If I can give them that assurance—" "Through Walsh," she said, thinking about it. "Yes, that works. I know it works. That's why I planned it." She looked at him with something that was unmistakably the beginning of a smile. It was the first one he'd seen from her since the gala that was not the composed performance but the actual thing, brief and genuine and involuntary. It was the most extraordinary thing he'd seen in months, which was, he understood, saying something. The weeks that followed were not a clean resolution. That was the truth of it, the version that the preceding months had made him capable of holding without needing to smooth it into something more comfortable. The Voss restructuring was slow and contentious and required conversations he'd never had before, with people who'd worked in the organization for years and who needed to understand what was changing and why, with legal structures that didn't accommodate the kind of transition he was attempting without significant friction, with himself, repeatedly, about where the lines were and what he was willing to hold and what he was willing to release. The veil continued. Evelyn ran it from a base that he now knew about and didn't know the specifics of, which was a balance they'd negotiated without quite calling it a negotiation. He understood its function. He understood its necessity. He didn't attend its meetings or access its infrastructure, and she didn't consult him on its operations. And this was not a deficiency in what they were building, but a structural feature of it. Two people who'd learned through specific and expensive experience where the boundaries of their respective domains needed to be. Marcus Vane relocated to a jurisdiction without extradition arrangements, as Evelyn had predicted, 8 weeks after the second round of indictments moved. The indictments caught 4 more members of the Korath group's inner structure. Vane's name still wasn't in them. Evelyn said nothing about this, and her face said nothing about this, and Damien didn't ask because he'd drawn his line and he intended to hold it. 4 months after the Navy Yard, on a night in late spring when the city had finally committed to a temperature that didn't require a coat, Damien came up to the roof terrace of the building in Midtown and found Evelyn already there. She'd been there often enough that her being there wasn't surprising. She had a habit of the roof when she needed to think, which he'd learned over the last 4 months the way you learn things about a person when you're actually paying attention, by accumulating small observations until the pattern becomes legible. She was standing at the north edge, looking at the skyline, with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking in the particular way she held wine at events and didn't drink it. He stood beside her. The city spread north and south and east in all its enormous, indifferent, lit complexity, and the spring air was the specific quality of New York spring that felt like the city exhaling after months of holding its breath against the cold. "Vane," she said. He waited. "It's done," she said. He looked at the skyline. He thought about her father, about a car accident that was not an accident, About 11 years of building something large enough and careful enough to eventually reach this point. He thought about the cost of it, which was not a small number and which she had paid without sharing the bill. "Are you okay?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. The question surprised her, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was the question underneath the question, and she hadn't expected him to ask the underneath one. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I thought it would feel like something specific. It feels like the absence of something I've been carrying for a long time, which is different from how I imagined it."
"That's usually how it is," he said. She looked at him. "You sound like you know." "I've put things down that I'd been carrying a long time," he said. "It always feels like loss first. The relief takes longer." She looked back at the city. He looked at it with her. The lights were doing what city lights did at this hour, the static shimmer of a million private lives happening simultaneously in the dark, none of them visible to each other, each one its own complete world. "My father would have liked you," she said. "The current version." He had no patience for men who couldn't learn. He heard what was inside that. He didn't speak into it right away because it was the kind of thing that deserved to land before anything else was placed beside it. After a while he said, "Tell me about him." She looked at him again. Longer this time, the specific assessing look of someone deciding whether to open a door they've kept closed for a very long time. Then she began to talk. He listened. The city moved below them. The spring night held its temperature against them, close and present, and the conversation went where it went, which was further in and further back than any conversation they'd had in 3 years of marriage that had been something other than this. The ring was still on his desk, where he'd placed it 4 months ago. "Not yet," he'd said. He thought about yet. About what yet looked like now, from this side of everything that had happened, standing on a rooftop in the spring with the city spread out below, and a woman beside him who had been extraordinary all along, and who he was, finally, in the slow and non-linear way that real things happened, beginning to see. Not yet was not never. Not yet was exactly what it said. A door that would open when the opening was honest rather than convenient, when trust had been rebuilt in the only way trust was ever actually rebuilt, which was through the accumulation of small-kept promises, rather than through any single gesture large enough to stand in for them. He didn't know how long that would take. He knew it was already happening. Below them, the city ran its permanent and indifferent night, full of lives in motion, full of people carrying things toward destinations they could and couldn't see. Above them, the sky did what the sky did above Manhattan. More dark than black, the stars washed out by the upward sprawl of all that human light, invisible but present there if you knew where to look. He looked. So did she. And for the first time in longer than either of them could accurately account for, what they were looking at was the same thing.